Well, my name's Ania Himbury Johansson, and I've never lived in Brunswick, but I spend a lot of time in the inner city and in Brunswick, and in particular I was involved in a small group of artists, and we were doing some work in Brunswick, and just came to know the site just by passing it and obviously seeing the chimneys. And at that stage it was already locked up. The development hadn't happened, but you know, it was just a very kind of mysterious, interesting looking site.
Okay, I'm Jo Conlon. I'm a Brunswick resident and have been for 20 years or more. And my first connection with this site was I came to see the Women's Circus do a performance here. It must be 15 years ago, I think, and it was just amazing because they had all these, they were using flames and they were going around these spaces here. You can imagine some act that they did. It was just perfect for that thing.
Yes, well, actually it's John Lawrence Cunningham, which will be a revelation to a lot of people. Just call me Laurie, actually. I've had a long septuagenarian plus, so I've lived in the area all this time. So I very much view these chimneys as icons of Brunswick, and I can remember when there was more.
In the 1980s, heritage studies weren't necessarily a prime focus of local governments. Brunswick had instituted an early heritage study at the very beginning of that decade. It was clear though that it was already badly out of date, that it didn't have a good focus or a sense of purpose to it. So we went through a review process.
My name is Chris Johnston. I'm a member of Save the Brickworks. My contact with this site goes back a really long way, and it connects to the Brunswick Heritage Study. It was being then done by Nigel Lewis and Richard Aitken, and that's, I don't know when, but that's sort of, 1980 something. And my then partner, Rod Elphinstone, was a Brickworks fanatic, I'd say. But I've done a lot of this in his memory. Because he died very young, so he died many years ago now, and in a way I got connected to this site through him, and I can see that it's a really interesting place, and I love industrial sites too. And so I've just kept, feeling like if he was still here, he would be fighting for this site. So I keep fighting for the site.
A very early version of Save the Brickworks was on the scene in the mid-1980s, and I think it became much more active through that period in which it became clear that the site was under threat. The real emergence of it as a movement, though, came during the period of commissioners, and during that period there was no elected council, and there was the councils had been amalgamated. Brunswick, Coburg and half of Broadmeadows had formed Moreland, and the creation of that new council really put us in a position where, with commissioners in charge of the council, with a different state government by then that had a different set of development objectives, we were under real threat here, we felt.
Mike Hill and I were involved in lobbying to get this site on the State Heritage Register, so nominating it and lobbying for it, lobbying the Minister for it. We were involved when the site closed in then trying to get some documentation done at the time. Other people set up Save the Brickworks, but I was a founding member of the Brunswick Community History Group, and so from that connection then got involved in Save the Brickworks that really Andy Ingham was involved in setting up, as others have probably said. And I've really just been involved ever since.
By the time I was involved in that, they're starting to get planning permits. The first lot had already gone through, which I was not involved at that stage, but later on going for planning permits. So it was a lot about trying to put in submissions, about improving what they were doing, and for each and every permit, lobbying the council to say, can you tie the restoration works into this permit? Don't let them keep building houses and not fixing the buildings. And we were spectacularly unsuccessful in that, as you can tell, which is why we sit here surrounded nearly by a developed site and not restored brickworks. But we were trying to do that, trying to work out what uses that we could have for the site. For example, we suggested to the council at one point that they asked the state government to take it over, to put in a dollar offer to the developer. I think they would have accepted the dollar for the site, and then to see what we could do, so at least you could keep it while we thought out what things to do. But that didn't come to anything.
Therese Healy's my name, and I used to live in Pearson Street. I moved there in '94, and I went overseas in '96, and when I came back in '97, and it was also, or politically, when Jeff Kennett was around, so there was a lot of upheaval happening, and I was really determined to try and make a difference in some way. And when I came home, there was a flyer about saving the Brickworks, having an initial meeting.
And through our interest in the site, we found out that there was a group called Save the Brickworks, and they were organising a tour of the site as part of their lobbying. So I came and had a look at it, and obviously was really, moved and excited by the space itself. Just an amazing space to be in. And through that involvement, I was brought on board to write a little booklet about the site, and it was written for Save the Brickworks as a lobbying tool, I guess. And what that book was about was just talking to locals around Brunswick, people who'd worked at the site, people who lived close by, artists who'd been inspired by the site, just interviewing them and finding out what their connections were with the space. So that was really great, because I just got to learn about the history of the site, but also just how important it was to people's everyday lives, just walking past it, or seeing the chimneys, or having done artwork. There have been lots of performances here, people have done photography, painting, that kind of thing. And so that was a pivotal point in the site's history. It was, we did a lot of looking at the planning applications. I actually have a background in planning, so that came in handy. There was lots of poring over the plans, just making sure that, what was supposed to be protected about the site was actually going to be protected in reality.
Well, I suppose what I'd looked for in this site was some sort of adaptive reuse, something that was going to involve a new set of activities within these kilns. I'd always assumed that housing was going to be one of our best options as part of that, but I was open to other ideas. I suppose it was really hard in those days with relatively low land values to actually achieve the sort of outcomes that we had in mind. So we did have some visioning sessions, we had some exploration sessions where we started looking at what some of those options might be. It was always hard to attract someone who was going to really drive them forward.
I think all of us support higher density living, and we're not opposed to development, but we want to have some historical continuity, and also think that high density living needs social spaces. It needs some sense of meaning and connection with the past and where it is.
To me, sort of history and people saving things were nice historic buildings like Como and that sort of thing, and it goes back to the working class history, that this was an industrial site that had a really high technology at the time, like it was cutting edge technology, but there were people here that were working, and they worked very hard in very unpleasant conditions. But at the same time, that's what kept their families going together. It kept that sense of community. So it was really important to respect and keep the industrial history going, because that's what people did. That was their lives.
Save the Brickworks and friends have done probably every possible thing to promote this site. We had an art exhibition of local people and the art that they'd done, paintings, photography, all sorts of things that they'd done. There's been exhibitions of the ceramics made on the site and a few bricks made on the site, and objects that workers still had in their possession. We made baby bricks on the street at the Sydney Road Festival some years ago, again as trying to promote the site and build public awareness of it.
But what was really important, especially when we did at the Sydney Road Festival, how many people, the older people that would come and have lots of stories about how important it was, but people actually moving into the area, which goes into the whole interpretation of the site, really wanted to know and were fascinated by, wow, that's what that building was doing, how old is it, that's incredible. So people that are here see it, and they actually want to know the story as well. So I guess that's the sort of the finish. It's, even if people haven't got their own personal history attachment to it, by just living here and seeing it, people actually want to know about it, and embrace it.
Oh, it's an amazing space. You can't really describe it, and you can't even describe it when you're looking at it from Dawson Street. It's quite a different experience being here, especially being in this spot where we are. even if I mean, the photographs of it that I've seen are absolutely beautiful. There was a women's circus performance on site, and so they took some stills of the women under these vaults, and yeah, just absolutely beautiful. But it's not the same as even the photographs aren't as good as actually being in here. And you know, there's a nice quality just as we're speaking. You know, it's very insulated and you feel very enclosed. It's a nice space to be in. And then the more open spaces of upstairs and the brick press shed. And, you know, I mean, first of all, my connection was a very aesthetic one. And then learning the history of how the place actually worked and the process of where the bricks went on their journey, and, you know, understanding what all the holes in the floor are upstairs. And, you know, that came later. But it's just really fascinating, and it'll be amazing to see when the interpretation is on site and people will understand the story.
I'm always struck by how unique and special these buildings are, and I mean, just for how cool it is today on a hot day, how solid they are, how obvious the sort of meaning and purpose and use of the building is in their design. I think it's really intrinsic, and I don't think you always get that in factory buildings, and I think the brick pressing shed's fabulous too for being able to see the whole process as it works.
When people come here and come on site like we're doing today, they're just astonished by the spaces, and the spaces are really very powerful. You know, the space we're sitting in now in the firing chamber of the kiln is a really powerful and very beautiful space, and I think people are astonished by that. They're astonished by the scale of the brick pressing shed and the fabulous timbers that are there. So when you come on the site, you can really sort of see what gets people passionate about it. But I think in other ways, because it's been closed for so long to the public, it's become a bit of a forgotten place, and people say, oh, is that still there, you know? But a few years ago, everyone knew it was here. There were trucks coming in and out every day. There were people working here.
I think there is that historical thing there. So people who've been here a while know that it was, you know, like a part of the thriving life of Brunswick. And then more recently, I suppose it's so huge, and it's very central in the map of Brunswick. So for people in Brunswick, you don't have to move very far from where you are to be aware of the chimneys or the space. And sadly, more recently, it's more like the brickworks that are a gap in the landscape because it's been closed off for so long. So I think people are just aware that there's this big looming site here, and people have a real curiosity about it. And even if they don't know the full history, they're kind of interested to know why it's shut away and what's going to happen to it.
I just think of the contribution that this site has made to the development of the rest of Melbourne. I think of Brunswick, a working community. I live in West Brunswick. I live very close to Hoffman's, and I now live in a building that was influenced by the evolution of the brick pits. I've now got an involvement in a hotel that was built to slake the thirst of the people who were working in these pits. Opposite me there's a little row of terrace houses that are very early development in that part of West Brunswick. Look, all associated with the Hoffman's site. So Hoffman's is West Brunswick, it is Brunswick, and I think it is Melbourne. I think just symbolises so much of the way in which Melbourne evolved, and we really need to do something to maintain that memory, otherwise it's going to be consigned to history books.